Hi there, everyone, and welcome to Paper Wishes Weekly Webisodes. I'm Sarah Newman, and I'm excited to bring you another episode of Mixed Media, the Paper Wishes Way. This week, we're going to continue our series on heat embossing techniques using 3 of the mixed media embossing powders from Creative Expressions. We'll also work with a couple of tools you might not think to use for embossing, a brayer and the Distress Splatter brush. Now, these supplies will help us to create rich, beautifully embossed backgrounds and accents. I have 2 techniques and 3 cards I want to show you today, and these will all feature the absolutely gorgeous Vintage Roses paper pack. I'm really glad that you're joining us for this fun series, so come play with us. Let's start with our embossing powders. We'll be working with 3 mixed media powders from Creative Expressions. We have Iron Age, Bronze Age, and Plantagenet. Now, these powders are unique because not only are they made up of many different contrasting colors, which I think you can see just looking in the jars, but they're also made up of different grades of embossing powder, so some thick and some fine. Now, this means the particles will melt at different speeds. Some are going to melt quickly and others a lot more slowly, and that's going to give you a beautiful and variegated look on your backgrounds. So you can see here are some of the swatches. Now for these, I just pressed my embossing ink pad right onto some white cardstock and then added the embossing powder. But this is a great way to really see the variety that you can get with just 1 jar of embossing powder. So this is the Iron Age. I think you can see some of that thick kind of goldish here in the corner, and then also this beautiful fine silver here in the middle. And the same goes for the other 2 as well. So you can see that these are really ideal for making easy backgrounds. So let's take a look at our first technique, which is creating an easy background using a brayer. You can see my brayer embossing on the background of my card here. Now, this is a really fun mixed media technique and a great one to have on hand, especially if you like to create really clean and simple card layouts. This is going to give you color and texture and dimension without overwhelming your main message. Now, the background is also really, really easy to make, which is one reason why it's one of my favorites. All you need to have is your brayer. Okay, so I'm going to pull aside my card and bring in some of the supplies that I'll need. So first of all, I've got a piece of folded white scrap paper. This is what I'm using to funnel my Bronze Age embossing powder back into the jar. So I'm just going to keep using that. I need my embossing ink pad, so I'm going to be using my WOW embossing ink pad for this, and of course my brayer. Now I'm going to do my embossing onto a piece of plain white cardstock, so I'm just going to pop this down here. Now all I need to do is simply use my brayer to apply the ink onto my cardstock. So I'm going to roll this across my embossing ink pad a couple of times. Now I know it's tricky to see because this is clear embossing ink. You do just want to make sure to roll it enough times so that you're really coating your brayer with that ink. So give it a good couple of rolls and then simply roll it onto your cardstock. You can go a couple of different directions if you want to. You can have a heavy application, a light application. The choice is yours. So then I'm just going to pop this into my scrap paper, take my embossing powder, and just kind of dump this on here. And I can be pretty generous because I know that this is all going to go back into the jar. Okay, so I'll just tap off the excess here, and you can see I've got some really interesting coverage on here. A really cool kind of pattern on here as well. Now, if I wanted to make the edging a little bit more of a matted effect, I just take my finger and run that across there just to run off some of that excess embossing powder. Just a little trick that'll give you kind of a nice edge before you do your heat setting. Okay, so then what I'll do is kind of fold this up. I'm going to dump back in the rest of the embossing powder into the jar, but for now I want to do my heat setting. And an important thing, I do want to make sure that I'm working onto a heat resistant surface like a craft mat. Definitely not directly on top of my wooden table. Okay, so make sure that you're ready and safe to go before you do your heat setting. So I'm going to come in with my heat tool and melt this embossing powder, and then we'll take a look. Okay, so my embossing powder is all melted and now I have this really cool background piece. Now it is a fairly large piece and it is still a little bit hot, so you do definitely want to make sure to let it cool thoroughly before you handle it. But once it's cool, then you can use it as your background, as I've done, or you can cut it or you can die cut it. Now I mentioned that you can vary the amount of ink and powder that you use so you can get some really different kinds of looks. Here's one that I've done that's got quite a bit of coverage on it. Here's one that's got a lot lighter coverage, and then of course this is the one that we just did. So a lot of different ways to get some different effects with this one technique. Okay, I'm going to bring back in my original card and let's take another look at this. Now I've simply mounted it up onto the front of my white card, and here I've used one of the cutouts from the Vintage Roses paper pack, and I've layered this up with some foam tape onto the hot off the press square and scalloped die. So this is my card focal. I've also fussy cut some leaves from the background of one of those beautiful patterned papers. And I like how this arrangement kind of leads your eye right into the card focal. A little bit of ribbon and I'm ready to go for a nice clean and simple design. For the card inside, I've just added a dazzle and a little heart dazzle on here and a little bit more of that absolutely gorgeous vintage paper. I just love this design. I think it's beautiful. Okay, and then back to the card front. So this is how easy it is to do Brayer embossing. Let's take a look at splatter embossing. For this card, I've created an area here with a splattered effect. Now this is done with Iron Age embossing powder and the Distress Splatter brush. It is not using any embossing ink whatsoever. In fact, it's using water. So we're going to take a look at this process. It's another easy one to do and one that gives you a really cool effect. Okay, I'm going to move aside my card and bring in a piece of white cardstock. This is what I'll do my splattering on. I've got my Distress Splatter brush, which has these nice long bristles. This is going to give me a really cool spattered effect. I've got my Iron Age embossing powder. I'm going to take this off, give this a little bit of a shake, and just kind of tilt it a little bit. If you want to, you can always sort of stir up your embossing powder as well if you wanted to kind of make sure that things are really well mixed. Do use something with a metal tip or a metal spoon, for example, rather than something plastic. Plastic will introduce static into the embossing powder, and that static is what really makes your embossing powder stick in areas you don't want it to. So use metal if you're going to give this a bit of a stir. Okay, the other thing I need to have is a little bit of water, and I'm going to mist the water right onto my craft sheet or onto some non-porous or waterproof surface. Take my Distress Splatter brush and I'm just going to kind of dip that in there. And then I'm going to hold this over my white cardstock and just fan those bristles so that I'm spattering on here. Now again, as with our other technique, I know it's really difficult to see because there's clear water, but just take a look. When I take my folded piece of scrap paper, open this up, and then add my embossing powder on here, you'll be able to see the effect. Okay, so I'm going to tap this off, and there you can see I've got some really cool splattered patterns on here. Now what I need to do is, as with any embossing technique, you want to work pretty quickly, but because we're using water rather than ink, you do need to work a little bit more speedily just to make sure you get it before the water dries. Now in this case, what I'm going to do is hold my piece of cardstock and I'm going to heat set from underneath. Okay, so as I mentioned, I started off my heat setting from the back of the cardstock. And the reason I did that is because if you come from the front straight away, it can tend to blow most of the powder right off. So I find that if I start by heat setting on the back and then finish off from the front, then I'm still able to get that beautiful pattern and reduce the amount of embossing powder that will sort of fly off from my cardstock. Now you might ask if you could simply spray your water onto your cardstock rather than using the distress splatter brush. The answer technically is yes, but what I discovered is that when I'm spraying water from my water mister right onto my cardstock, I tend to get a lot more water than I want, and as a result, I get less of this really cool pattern as a result. I just really love the amount of control you can have with that splatter brush and how you can create some really cool effects like this. Now this is with the Iron Age, and I also wanted to show you another swatch that I did. This is with the Plantagenets, and I just think this looks absolutely beautiful as well. So it doesn't matter what color of that embossing powder you're going to be splattering with, you will definitely have a really cool effect. Okay, I'm going to bring back in my card, and again, you can see my splattered piece right down here is the border of my card front. Now I've also worked in, of course, some dazzles, a little bit of jute twine. I've also got some crepe ribbon on here, and I love the contrast in texture and color between the embossing and the ribbon and the jute and the metallic shine of that beautiful dazzle. I think it all comes together really nicely with lots of mixed media contrasts. Now on the inside of the card, you can see I've used just a little tiny strip of splatter embossed cardstock. So every little bit can be used for a nice little touch either on the inside or outside of your card. I've got some dazzles and again, more of that gorgeous patterned paper. Now, the last card that I want to show you is a combination of both the splatter technique and the brayering technique. For this card, I've done some splatter embossing directly onto my beautiful Vintage Roses patterned paper here. And I've embossed that with the Plantagenet, which is this beautiful green color. Now, I've also got a border going down along the edge here, and this is using both the Brayer embossing and the splatter embossing. And I know it's kind of a subtle detail on here, but I did want to show you this technique. So I'm going to move aside my card for a minute, and I'm going to bring in a piece of cardstock where I've already done my Brayer embossing using the Bronze Age embossing powder. So this is all heat set and ready to go, ready to be used. But I wanted to add a nice contrasting color, and isn't this gorgeous green going to work perfectly? So what I'm going to do here is add our splatter embossing on top of our Brayer embossing. Really easy to do. Again, just adding some water onto my craft sheet, use my distress splatter brush and splatter that water on here. Again, just do a little bit more here. And then I'm going to grab a piece of my scrap paper, pop this down, and add my embossing powder on top. And there we go. You can see where I've got some of the hints of that beautiful Plantagenet color on here. Now all I need to do, of course, is just heat set, and I'm ready to go. So quick, easy, and a very simple process to do. I'm going to move this aside, and instead of heat setting, because I know you've already seen me do quite a lot of heat setting already, I'm just going to bring back in my card, and we can take another look at this as well. So you can see I've just added my border on here. Then for the inside, a little bit more of that splatter embossing and another message from the Vintage Roses collection. So today we've continued our embossing techniques to include Brayer embossing and splatter embossing and a combination of both. Hopefully these versatile techniques have inspired you to look at embossing powders in a new way. Thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for being a part of the Paper Wishes family. We're so glad that you're here with us. I can't wait to see what you create as you explore mixed media the Paper Wishes way. Do be sure to leave a comment. We love to hear what you think. Each item can be purchased separately, and you can see them below. However, we've also bundled them into a creative money saver just for you. For the money saver, just see this webisode on paperwishes.com.